Every man who ever chose honesty over manipulation has asked this question in the silent hours when results refuse to match effort. The ones who lie advance faster. The ones who exploit walk away richer. The ones who abandon every principle seem untouched by consequence, while integrity delivers another invoice for doing what was right. Something fundamental breaks inside when the scoreboard contradicts every sermon ever heard about justice. And that fracture runs deeper than disappointment because it touches the architecture of how reality was supposed to function. This erosion happens gradually in spaces where promises were made about divine order and moral consequence. Watching someone betray a partnership and immediately land a better opportunity plants a seed of suspicion. Seeing manipulation rewarded in leadership while transparency gets punished waters that seed until doubt becomes a private companion. The question stops being theological and becomes operational. Does choosing right actually matter when wrong appears to be winning comprehensively? Scripture never pretended this tension was imaginary, and recognizing the dissonance might be the first honest step toward understanding what victory actually means when stripped of its costume. The problem intensifies because repetition creates pattern recognition. Once becomes isolated incident, twice becomes coincidence, 10 times becomes system, and the mind begins recalibrating what works versus what sounds noble in theory. Men start wondering if patience is just another word for getting passed over, if integrity is naivety dressed in religious language, if faith means accepting perpetual disadvantage while others play by entirely different rules. The internal shift happens without announcement, a slow recalculation of whether principles should bend when rigidity appears to guarantee irrelevance. Biblical narratives refuse to sanitize this reality, recording voices that confronted the same imbalance with raw frustration. David watched enemies prosper while running for his life through desert caves. Asaph stood in the temple watching the arrogant multiply wealth while his own feet nearly slipped from maintaining righteousness. Jeremiah questioned why the treacherous thrived while he suffered for delivering truth. These moments saturate Scripture not as failures of faith, but as evidence that confusion in the presence of injustice indicates spiritual awareness rather than spiritual weakness. The text validates struggle without endorsing surrender, acknowledging that doubt often arrives at the intersection where belief confronts observable reality. What appears as winning deserves closer examination because surface measurements fail catastrophically when applied to sustainability. Influence gained through deception requires constant management. Wealth accumulated through exploitation carries hidden maintenance costs. Advancement secured by stepping on others creates a foundation composed entirely of enemies and witnesses. The structure looks impressive during construction, mimicking legitimate success closely enough to confuse observers, but weight eventually reveals what speed concealed during assembly. Scripture draws distinctions that modern metrics ignore, separating accumulation from blessing and achievement from alignment. Solomon accumulated unprecedented wealth and wisdom, yet his internal deterioration mirrored his external expansion, until the end of his account reads like documentation of magnificent emptiness. The rich fool built bigger barns while his soul faced foreclosure that same night. Success measured by what can be photographed rarely accounts for what happens in private when applause fades and the mirror reflects someone unrecognizable. The biblical lens refuses to celebrate gain that costs identity, influence that requires compromise, or victory that demands becoming what was opposed initially. If someone right now finds themselves measuring progress by how closely it matches what others display publicly, the foundation might already be shifting. Subscribe if recognizing that pattern just surfaced something uncomfortable. Delayed justice feels unbearable because human perception operates on immediate feedback loops, while divine timing functions through comprehensive process. The mind craves resolution within observable time frames, demanding that wrong receive visible consequence and right produce tangible reward before the situation fades from relevance. When delay extends beyond reasonable waiting, it registers as absence rather than strategy, neglect rather than intentional pacing. Yet Scripture repeatedly presents delay not as divine disinterest but as exposure mechanism that reveals character through pressure rather than hiding it behind speed. Metal tested by fire shows internal composition that polished surfaces conceal. Quick heat might create impressive appearance while slow sustained temperature exposes every flaw and confirms every strength. The process feels punishing to the one being tested, especially when others skip testing entirely and still receive acceptance. But the distinction emerges when weight gets applied. What was refined holds, what was merely polished crumbles, and the difference becomes obvious in moments that matter rather than moments that impress. Habakkuk confronted this dynamic directly when violence surrounded him, while divine response seemed delayed beyond logic. The answer he received acknowledged the frustration while reframing the timeline, explaining that revelation awaits appointed time, and though it lingers, it will not prove false, because hastening it would compromise what needs to unfold completely. Delay in that framework becomes protective, preventing premature exposure that would destroy what it was meant to establish, preserving character while truth matures toward undeniable manifestation. The psychological toll of watching injustice thrive creates subtle damage that often goes unnoticed, until resentment has restructured priorities completely. Envy disguises itself as righteous indignation, bitterness masquerades as discernment, and comparison slowly replaces purpose as the primary lens for evaluating personal trajectory. Fixation on what others gain through compromise drains energy that was meant for building something that lasts, redirecting focus from assignment to scoreboard until exhaustion becomes inevitable, regardless of actual progress. Wisdom literature addresses this trap with precision, warning that fretting over evildoers leads only to harm, and that envy of the prosperous wicked is futile because their end approaches while roots lack depth. The instruction sounds dismissive until the cost of obsession becomes clear. Staring at another runner's lane guarantees losing focus on personal stride, burning energy monitoring someone else's pace while personal form deteriorates. The race becomes about them instead of about finishing. And even if they stumble, the one watching has already lost something irretrievable by making their movement the reference point. Psalm 73 documents this progression with uncomfortable honesty. Asaph nearly abandoned faith entirely because prosperity of the wicked made righteousness feel pointless. They had no struggles. Their bodies were healthy and strong. They were free from common burdens. And pride became their necklace while violence covered them like clothing. Watching that contrast while maintaining integrity felt like washing hands in vain, like receiving punishment all day for choosing right. The turning point came not through their downfall, but through entering the sanctuary and understanding their final destiny, seeing how slippery the ground beneath apparent stability actually was, and how sudden destruction awaited what looked unshakable. What it truly means to win, according to biblical revelation, operates on entirely different metrics than cultural definitions provide. Endurance itself becomes victory when everyone else quit. Integrity maintained under pressure outweighs advancement gained through compromise. Alignment with truth creates foundation that cannot be stolen, reversed, or invalidated by changing circumstances. These victories lack immediate visibility, rarely generate applause, and almost never trend on platforms designed to measure surface engagement, yet they compound in ways that external achievement cannot replicate. Scripture elevates figures who appeared defeated in their moment, while those who seemed untouchable vanished from relevance within a generation. Joseph spent years in prison for refusing compromise, yet his integrity positioned him to preserve nations when famine arrived. Daniel faced execution for maintaining prayer, yet his faithfulness established him as irreplaceable in multiple empires. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked into fire rather than bow, and their refusal redefined what was possible for everyone watching. None of them looked like they were winning during the test. All of them proved victorious in ways that outlasted their accusers. Legacy defines success more accurately than temporary surroundings ever could. What outlives a person matters more than what impresses during a season, and biblical history confirms that those who compromise for immediate gain become cautionary tales, while those who endure become foundations. The question shifts from whether integrity pays immediately to whether becoming someone worth being is worth the cost of not becoming what wins right now. Spiritual authority operates completely differently than surface control, though they often get confused because both can look like power from a distance. Many who appear powerful function from fear, constantly defending what they gained through methods that create instability. They cannot rest because their position requires perpetual maintenance, and their influence evaporates the moment pressure reveals foundation. Biblical narratives contrast this with individuals rooted in obedience who carry authority without needing domination, influence without requiring performance, and impact that persists because it was built on truth rather than impression management. Consider whether recent decisions have been motivated by peace or pressure. If pressure has been driving movement consistently, recalibration might be overdue. The loudest presence in a room is rarely the strongest, but often the most insecure, requiring volume to compensate for lack of substance. Signal gets mistaken for noise, and actual authority gets overlooked because it does not demand attention the same way performance does. Jesus embodied this distinction, carrying absolute authority while those in official positions scrambled to maintain appearance. His words carried weight that religious leaders could not replicate despite their titles, and crowds recognized the difference, even when they could not articulate why truth resonated differently than religious performance. Integrity can feel like it leads toward insignificance, especially when media amplifies those who manipulate and ignores those who serve quietly. The fear that doing right means becoming invisible haunts men who were told righteousness would be rewarded, but instead watch promotion bypass them repeatedly. Yet Scripture systematically elevates those who refuse shortcuts, often positioning them to influence moments that define generations, while those who grabbed early advantage fade into footnotes. Obscurity is not absence, but preparation, and many biblical figures were preserved in hidden seasons precisely because public exposure would have destroyed them before they were ready. Moses spent 40 years in wilderness before leading Exodus. David was anointed king, but spent years running from Saul before sitting on the throne. Paul was converted dramatically but then spent years in Arabia before beginning public ministry. The hidden seasons were not wasted time, but necessary formation that public visibility would have interrupted catastrophically. What looks like winning often turns out to be delayed loss, while what feels like losing may be refinement securing something permanent. The distinction becomes clearer with distance because immediate circumstances create distortion that time eventually corrects. Plenty of people celebrated at the wrong moment, assuming arrival when they were actually approaching collapse, and plenty suffered through what felt like failure while foundation was being poured for something they would not see for years. Biblical justice is not reactive but comprehensive, accounting for motives alongside actions and consequences alongside intentions. Surface judgment misses layers that divine assessment includes, which is why outcome does not always align with expectation in observable timeframes. The wicked may prosper for a season while seeds planted through their methods germinate toward harvest they will not enjoy. The righteous may struggle through years that feel unrewarded, while roots deepen toward stability that sudden success would have prevented. Faith is not proven by outcomes, but by who someone becomes while waiting. The test is not whether everything works out visibly, but whether character holds when pressure would justify compromise. Plenty of people maintained belief as long as results confirmed it. But their faith was conditional on circumstances rather than rooted in conviction. Real faith shows up in spaces where following through makes no immediate sense, where obedience costs more than it pays in the short term, where choosing right delivers another consequence instead of another reward. The question that opened this narrative does not resolve into simple answer, because reality contains tension that easy answers cannot hold. Divine justice operates comprehensively across timelines that human perspective cannot measure accurately from the middle of the story. What seems like neglect might be protection. What feels like punishment might be refinement. What looks like winning might be the beginning of collapse. And what appears as losing might be the foundation of something unshakable being constructed beneath the surface where evaluation cannot reach yet. Choosing integrity, knowing it may never be applauded publicly, maintaining truth when lies advance faster, refusing compromise when shortcuts deliver immediate results requires deciding whether the goal is comfort now or alignment that lasts. The decision shapes everything that follows, and the biblical witness suggests that those who endure discover eventually that they were not losing, but building something others could not take, replicate, or invalidate regardless of what happened around them. The apparent winners became warnings. The faithful became foundations. The difference took time to reveal, but revelation came nonetheless, and those who waited saw what those who grabbed missed entirely. There exists another dimension to this struggle that surfaces when examining how corruption spreads through systems that reward it. When organizations promote based on politics rather than performance, when industries elevate those willing to cut ethical corners, when entire sectors function on unspoken agreements to ignore standards, the individual choosing differently faces isolation that extends beyond missing opportunities. The pressure becomes social, professional, and financial simultaneously, creating conditions where maintaining principles feels like volunteering for exclusion from networks that control access to advancement. This systemic dimension makes the choice harder because it stops being about competing with individuals and becomes about opposing structures. When an entire industry operates on kickbacks, the one refusing to participate does not just lose a deal, but gets labeled difficult, unrealistic, or self-righteous. When a corporate culture rewards those who take credit for others' work, the person insisting on accurate attribution gets marked as someone who does not understand how things work. The cost multiplies because the system protects its own, and standing outside that protection means facing consequences designed specifically to discourage dissent. Job experienced this isolation when his suffering was interpreted by friends as evidence of hidden sin, when his reputation was destroyed alongside his wealth and health, when maintaining innocence meant arguing against the collective verdict of everyone around him. His wife suggested cursing God and dying as the logical response to prolonged suffering without explanation. His friends built elaborate theological arguments to prove that his condition proved his guilt. The cultural and religious system both concluded that visible suffering meant invisible sin. Yet Job refused to confess what he had not done simply to satisfy expectations or resolve social tension. The narrative never promises Job that his faithfulness will be rewarded within any specific time frame. The restoration comes after chapters of wrestling with questions that receive no direct answers, after extended periods where maintaining truth meant enduring accusations that his stance was arrogant rebellion against divine correction. The text presents integrity as its own category, valuable regardless of whether circumstances shift to validate it externally. Job's vindication arrives eventually, but the core test was whether he would hold position without knowing if vindication would come at all. Another aspect that complicates this dynamic involves watching people who once shared commitment to principles gradually abandon them after repeated disappointment. When someone who used to insist on transparency starts justifying small deceptions for practical reasons, when a leader who once prioritized people begins treating them as expendable resources, When a friend who valued honesty adopts strategic ambiguity as standard communication, the erosion becomes contagious. Witnessing others surrender creates pressure that whispers maybe they figured something out. Maybe holding on is just stubbornness disguised as conviction. Maybe adaptation is wisdom rather than compromise. This social proof works powerfully because humans are designed to learn from observing outcomes in others' lives. When multiple people take the easier path and appear to suffer no consequences, while the one holding standards watches opportunities evaporate, the mind begins building case against continued resistance. The internal argument sounds reasonable at first, framed as maturity rather than surrender, as learning to work within reality rather than insisting reality conform to ideals. The shift feels like gaining perspective when it might actually be losing position. Proverbs addresses the danger of bad company corrupting character, warning that companions of fools will suffer harm, and that walking with the wise brings wisdom while associating with the corrupt invites destruction. The instruction recognizes that proximity shapes perception gradually, that spending time around those who mock integrity eventually makes integrity seem mockable, that hearing justifications for compromise repeatedly makes compromise sound justified. Friendship and professional association are not neutral factors but active influences that either reinforce or erode commitment depending on what they normalize. The passage warns not just about avoiding obviously wicked people, but about recognizing how slow erosion happens through exposure to mindsets that rationalize small compromises until large betrayals seem logical. The person does not wake up one day deciding to abandon everything they believed, but instead takes incremental steps that each seemed reasonable in isolation, until looking back reveals how far the position shifted from where it started. Awareness of this progression becomes critical because the danger lies precisely in how natural and justified each step feels while it is happening. Then there is the practical reality that choosing differently often means earning less, advancing slower, and working harder for results that others achieve through methods that were refused. The financial pressure becomes tangible when bills arrive regardless of whether income was earned through compromise, when opportunities that could have solved problems get declined because accepting them required becoming someone else, when watching family needs go unmet because the income that would address them was attached to conditions that could not be accepted. This material dimension tests faith in ways that abstract principle never touches because hunger is not theoretical. Eviction notices are not philosophical, and watching children do without because their parent refused a lucrative offer that required ethical flexibility creates real tension between conviction and responsibility. The question becomes whether faith is supposed to mean accepting disadvantage in practical matters, or whether there is provision that does not require compromise, and the answer is not always clear when the bank account contradicts the sermon. Biblical narratives include people who faced real material consequences for obedience without immediate divine intervention reversing those consequences. Prophets who delivered accurate messages were imprisoned, killed, or exiled rather than celebrated and compensated. Faithful individuals lost homes, possessions, and livelihoods without dramatic reversals arriving to prove their choice was worthwhile in measurable terms. The text does not promise that righteousness prevents hardship, but rather that righteousness defines identity regardless of what hardship accompanies it. Choosing integrity, knowing it may never be applauded publicly, maintaining truth when lies advance faster, refusing compromise when shortcuts deliver immediate results, requires deciding whether the goal is comfort now or alignment that lasts. The decision shapes everything that follows, and the biblical witness suggests that those who endure discover eventually that they were not losing but building something others could not take, replicate, or invalidate regardless of what happened around them. The apparent winners became warnings, the faithful became foundations. The difference took time to reveal, but revelation came nonetheless, and those who waited saw what those who grabbed missed entirely.